East Prussia. August 1944. The air is thick with smoke and certainty. German generals lean over maps, laughing softly at American madness. Fuel, distance, terrain, all against them. To the men in this room, war is a calculation, and the math is flawless. They believe Patton will stop before the week ends. Pencils scratch on paper. Numbers march like soldiers across the page. Gallons, miles, tons. Formulas of certainty. They whisper that physics itself will stop Patton's tanks. No army can move faster than its fuel. No force can outrun its own shadow. They don't yet know that shadows can move too. But far to the west, in the rain and darkness, engines rumble like distant thunder. Thousands of trucks, headlights blazing, stretch across France. Men who have no idea the world is watching them drive toward history. The Red Ball Express has begun to move, unseen, unstoppable. In the war rooms, the generals still laugh, but the laughter sounds thinner now, fading under the growl of engines. The math they trust is already breaking, because war, like life, is never just numbers. It's motion, courage, and men who refuse to stop. Stay with this story and discover how American trucks defeated German tanks. The German generals trusted distance more than destiny. They believed the earth itself would stop the American advance. 400 miles from the Normandy beaches to Patton's armored spearheads. Too far, too fragile, too ambitious. They spoke of gallons and gravity as if both were gods. To them, a tank was not a weapon, but a problem of consumption. One division could drink 150,000 gallons of fuel in a single day. And the Americans had 12 such divisions. Even if their industry was vast, even if their courage was endless, how could that river of fuel reach them through shattered roads and broken bridges? They watched the maps like oracles, whispering of limits and inevitability. They were certain that distance itself would become their greatest ally. But in war, certainty is the first thing to die. For every mile the Americans advanced, their engineers found a way to stretch that invisible lifeline farther. They called it logistics, but it was closer to faith. Somewhere, under the soft hum of trucks being fueled, history was rewriting its own math. And the laws of distance were about to collapse. While the generals calculated and waited for the American engines to run dry, Patton refused to wait. His tanks rolled eastward like a restless tide, devouring villages, bridges, and distance. The soldiers slept on the steel hulls, their faces marked by dust and oil. They had no time for comfort, only for movement. Every new dawn found them farther inland than anyone expected. Their commanders didn't talk about fuel, they talked about speed. Momentum itself had become a weapon, and in that momentum lived something the Germans couldn't quantify: belief. Behind this wall of armor, a hum began to grow. Faint at first, like a heartbeat beneath the ground. It was the sound of engines that did not belong to tanks, but to trucks. Thousands of them, invisible to the headlines, already moving to feed the hunger of war. They carried fuel, food, ammunition, and something else: possibility. Each truck that roared through the night whispered a new truth: that in this war, the winners would not be those who shot faster, but those who never stopped moving. In the quiet corners of France, far from glory or headlines, a new kind of soldier began to dream. They weren't gunners or tankers, but engineers, mechanics, and planners. They sat at tables covered with maps, arguing in whispers about time, terrain, and trucks. What if the roads themselves could become a weapon? What if fuel could move like a living thing? A pulse, a rhythm, a constant flow. No stops, no waiting, only motion. They would call it a one-way highway, the Red Ball Express. It would run day and night, headlights blazing through the dark. An endless river of steel and gasoline, defying every law the Germans believed in. The idea sounded insane, and yet within 48 hours it was real. French civilians watched in disbelief as convoys appeared out of nowhere. Engines thundered through the rain, carrying 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. The night itself glowed with the light of headlights. To the Germans, it looked like madness. To the Americans, it was music. And somewhere between those two truths, a new kind of warfare was born. For weeks, the German staff believed that Patton would soon stop. They trusted the numbers more than the men who fought. Fuel was finite. Distance was merciless. And no army could outrun its own supply lines. They had learned that truth in Russia, in Africa, in every place where wheels sank into mud and horses collapsed from hunger. So they waited, calmly confident, watching maps glow beneath lamplight as arrows crept east. Every inch was measured, every mile calculated. Then the reports began to arrive. Endless convoys, headlights burning through the night, moving as if distance no longer mattered. At first, they laughed. Then they fell silent. Reconnaissance planes confirmed what no formula could explain. The roads of France were alive. Engines never stopped, and the American advance did not slow. The numbers had lied. Now, the maps felt strange in their hands. Lines that once meant certainty now spoke of chaos. German officers stared at each other across tables crowded with paper and fear. Some said the Americans had found a secret fuel. Others said they had found a way to defy time itself. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. They were watching a new kind of warfare, one that no academy had taught them to fight. A war of motion, a war of machines that never rested. And as the sound of those distant trucks echoed through the night, the German High Command began to understand that their science had met its end. By the end of August, the impossible had become routine. Nearly 6,000 trucks rolled across France each day, their headlights weaving a glowing thread through rain and dust. Drivers worked until their hands bled, then worked again. Engines burned the air with heat and oil, and still they moved. Each vehicle was a heartbeat in a giant mechanical body that never slept. Every 20 hours, the same roads filled again with motion, as if France itself had found a pulse. From the sky, it looked like a river of light cutting the dark continent in half. From the ground, it felt like destiny. The Red Ball Express was no longer a plan or a theory. It was alive. And for the first time, German soldiers feared not Patton's tanks, but the men who fed them. Those drivers did not know they were changing the course of a war. They only knew that if they stopped, someone else would die. So they kept going, through fog, through flames, through nights that felt endless. Their convoy was a living prayer made of metal and exhaust. Every mile was a test of faith, every delivery a promise kept. If you're still listening, leave a like so this story keeps rolling, because the road ahead is just beginning. Ahead waits a new chapter, where the Red Ball Express will be born in full light. What does a miracle look like when it has wheels? You'll see soon enough. It began in a small, crowded room lit by a single lamp. Maps covered the walls like silent witnesses. Officers of the Motor Transport Service gathered around a table, their faces pale from exhaustion and disbelief. The front had moved faster than their plans could follow. Fuel lines were stretched to breaking, railways were shattered, and Patton's armored columns were running on fumes. Every normal rule of supply had already failed. Then a voice, steady, calm, but urgent, broke the silence. "We'll make a one-way highway," he said. "No stops, no sleep, no turning back." The others stared as if he had spoken madness, but desperation has a strange way of making impossible ideas sound reasonable. Within minutes, the room filled with movement, pencils scratching, maps redrawn. What began as a desperate suggestion became an operation that would feed an army. Outside, rain tapped against the windows like distant artillery. The men inside did not notice. They were creating something new, a living artery of motion. No one spoke of glory. They spoke of trucks, schedules, fuel depots, drivers, the language of survival. And as dawn crept over France, a plan had been born that would rewrite the meaning of logistics. The Germans believed physics would stop the Americans, but physics had never met American determination. The Red Ball Express was about to take its first breath. When the first trucks rolled, even their drivers didn't understand the scale of what they were beginning. The order was simple. Drive east, 20 hours a day. Rest only when the road ends. The route stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines, a single endless vein of steel and will. Headlights stayed on through the night, ignoring blackout discipline. Every 5 minutes, another convoy departed, each truck loaded with ammunition, food, or fuel. There were no traffic lights, no hesitations, no turning around. Forward only. It was the rhythm of inevitability, and it soon had a name whispered among the ranks: the Red Ball Express. French civilians woke to the roar of engines that never stopped. They watched thousands of trucks pass in perfect formation, each one marked by a red circle, the sign of priority. Soldiers leaned from windows, waving at children who stood in wonder. The road itself became a symbol of movement, of freedom, of a nation that refused to stand still. And though breakdowns were constant and roads shattered under weight, replacements arrived faster than failure. The Germans had their equations. The Americans had their engines. And, for the first time in the war, logistics moved faster than the front. They came from every corner of America. Men who had never seen Europe, most of them young, most of them black. They were not trained for glory, but for endurance. In a segregated army that still doubted their worth, they climbed into cabs and began to prove history wrong. The Red Ball Express became their battlefield, a highway of courage where exhaustion, fear, and pride shared the same seat. Each driver memorized the hum of his engine, the vibration of worn tires, the smell of oil that filled the night. They carried more than fuel and ammunition. They carried the rhythm of victory itself. Convoys stretched over the horizon, headlights disappearing into fog. Some drivers sang quietly to stay awake. Others whispered prayers between shifts. They faced air raids, broken bridges, and sleepless nights that lasted forever. Yet they smiled when they passed one another on the road, sharing a small salute that said everything. Keep moving. For 72 days, they did just that. They became the pulse of an army that refused to stop. The Germans had tanks and tactics, but these men had something greater, faith on 4 wheels. And soon the world would know their names. The Red Ball Express had no beginning and no end. It simply existed, like a pulse running through the veins of Europe. Every hour of every day, 5,000 trucks moved in 2 directions, loaded east, empty west. From above, it looked like a living circuit, glowing across the French countryside. The trucks ran with headlights blazing, ignoring every rule of wartime caution. Blackout discipline was forgotten, traffic laws abandoned. If a vehicle broke down, it was pushed aside, its cargo transferred in minutes. Mechanics worked on the roadside with engines still hot, their tools singing in rhythm with the motors. The night air smelled of gasoline, rubber, and rain. Nothing about it was elegant, but it worked. The line never stopped. To German eyes, it was insanity. No concealment, no order, no silence. Yet that chaos produced more efficiency than any plan their war rooms could design. They saw convoys moving faster than their tanks could retreat. They saw fuel arriving before need, ammunition before request. Every calculation, every equation they trusted, failed before this new reality. They began to understand this was not logistics. This was creation. The Americans had built a machine that never slept, a storm of wheels and will that no army on earth could stop. By early September, the Red Ball Express had become something larger than its creators imagined. It was no longer a supply line. It was a living system, a civilization of motion. Over 20,000 men worked without pause, building, driving, repairing. Fuel dumps rose every few miles, and temporary cities appeared overnight. Camps of tents, workshops, food depots, miles of spare tires. Even the French villagers, who had lived for years under silence and rationing, now heard the heartbeat of freedom echoing down their roads. Children waved at headlights, and the soldiers waved back. In the glow of those lights, you could almost believe that progress itself had taken form. Burning, humming, unstoppable. And yet, this was only the beginning. For every ton delivered, the demand grew. The further Patton advanced, the hungrier his army became. The Red Ball Express had given birth to something beyond calculation, a momentum that no map could capture. Soon it would need more drivers, more trucks, more courage. Ahead waited a test of endurance that would turn this highway of motion into a legend of faith. In the next chapter, the engines will roar louder, the convoys will stretch farther, and the men behind the wheels will become the unseen heroes of a nation that refused to stop. The convoy became music, slow, steady, and alive. Every truck, every gear, every echo on the road created a rhythm that no composer could write. The Red Ball Express moved through darkness like a living organism. Its breath, the hum of engines, its pulse, the hiss of air brakes. Drivers followed the same route again and again, east with hope, west with exhaustion. The sound was constant, the kind of sound that fills dreams and never fades. Somewhere in that noise was something sacred, a melody built not from instruments, but from movement. Each morning, the sun rose over the same dusty roads, yet every dawn felt earned. Mechanics crawled under trucks half asleep, engines still hot from the last run. Fuel drums rolled like thunder, and men smiled at the sight of another day survived. The road never ended, and that was its beauty. For these men, stopping was defeat. So they kept rolling, through mud, through fog, through silence. Freedom, it seemed, didn't march on feet. It rolled on tires. They called it chaos, but within that chaos lived precision. Mechanics worked in ditches, fixing engines by touch alone. The Red Ball Express consumed machines faster than factories could replace them. But instead of fear, there was rhythm. Trucks died, and others took their place. Bolts, tires, engines, nothing stayed still for long. Every man learned that perfection was useless. Motion was everything. As long as something moved, the war could continue. Night after night. Men welded by flashlight, hands trembling from exhaustion. They whispered jokes through the smoke, sharing coffee that tasted of oil. They worked not for medals, but for momentum. And when dawn came, they stood silently as convoys rolled past, engines rumbling like an orchestra they had just tuned. They were priests of machinery, servants of motion. And though no one would remember their names, every victory carried the fingerprints of their work. For 72 days, the convoy did not stop. 5,000 trucks became a moving horizon, stretching from sea to battlefront. Drivers learned to navigate by instinct, counting turns, memorizing trees, driving through exhaustion until the world blurred. Some saw the same stretch of road so many times that it haunted their dreams. Yet the motion never broke. Even when engines failed, or men collapsed, replacements stepped in. To stop was unthinkable. German pilots watched from above, reporting a glowing river of light that never dimmed. They could bomb it, but it returned. They could intercept it, but it grew. The Red Ball Express had become something spiritual, a pilgrimage of endurance. For the men behind those wheels, fatigue was the only enemy left. Still they drove, whispering to themselves, to their engines, to the dark. Each mile was a prayer, each light in the distance a promise. Silence was rare on the Red Ball Express, and when it came, it was heavy. Drivers who stopped for repairs could feel the night press against them like a living thing. The wind carried echoes of engines far away, a reminder that motion never truly ceased. Sometimes they spoke to their trucks as if they were alive, whispering encouragement, apologies, prayers. Just a few more miles, they would murmur. Keep going. In that quiet, a strange bond grew between man and machine. No medals could measure what they endured. Some drove 70 hours without rest, their eyes red from dust and rain. Others fell asleep mid-turn, only to be jolted awake by the road itself. Yet they laughed, shared cigarettes, sang to stay awake. The Red Ball Express was more than fuel and supplies. It was humanity in motion. Every man carried not just cargo, but the hope of those who waited beyond the horizon. And hope must never stall. By mid-September, the road had become a legend. The Red Ball Express delivered more than fuel. It delivered belief. Patton's tanks moved faster than ever before, powered by an invisible army of drivers and mechanics who never saw the front, yet carried it on their backs. To the Germans, it was madness. To the Americans, it was destiny. At night, soldiers could hear the hum of trucks long before they saw them. A lullaby of engines that meant one thing: they were not alone. Those men, most of them young and unseen, had turned logistics into victory. They had proven that courage doesn't always carry a rifle. Sometimes it carries a steering wheel. So, if you're still awake, still listening, subscribe so our convoy of stories keeps rolling through history. Because ahead, in the next chapter, the Germans begin to watch in disbelief. Their confidence will break, and their laughter will fade. The Red Ball Express is about to reveal what fear sounds like when it runs out of fuel. German reconnaissance pilots reported strange lights moving across France, lines of white that never ended. Through the night, entire valleys glowed as if rivers of glass were flowing east. When they first saw it, they thought it was a trick, a reflection from the moon or a fire burning beyond control. But as they descended, they realized it was movement. Thousands of vehicles, headlights blazing, crawling across the land like veins of light. The reports that followed were filled with disbelief. Continuous column, one wrote. No blackout discipline. No spacing between vehicles. To every German trained in caution, it looked like madness. Yet that madness had order. The trucks rolled with the precision of a heartbeat, 5 minutes apart, 24 hours a day. Every village they passed through flickered with the glow of their headlights. Farmers woke from their sleep. Children whispered prayers. Soldiers stared from ruined windows. The Germans saw not an army, but an ocean. It was the sound that haunted them most. Engines without end. A mechanical storm that drowned the silence of occupied France. Some said it was beautiful. Others said it sounded like doom. In East Prussia, the German High Command gathered around their maps once again. Reports from the Western Front came in like stories from another world. Continuous convoys, roads overflowing with American trucks. No blackout, no pause. Field commanders insisted it was impossible, that the numbers were wrong. The Americans don't have that many vehicles, one officer said. And even if they do, they cannot keep them running. But the photographs said otherwise. Aerial film reels showed the impossible in motion. The Red Ball Express was defying everything German science held sacred: fuel limits, mechanical endurance, human exhaustion. Some commanders grew quiet. Others grew angry. They had built their doctrines on efficiency, on conserving every drop, every bolt, every tire. Now they faced an enemy that seemed to worship waste, and still won. To them, it was heresy. One general whispered, "They fight with abundance." He was right. The Red Ball Express had become a moving factory of willpower and excess. Every broken engine was replaced, every empty tank refilled before it cooled. And as the maps filled with arrows of American advance, one truth became undeniable. The enemy had found a way to turn industry into momentum. They began to hear it before they saw it. In the forests of northern France, German patrols reported a constant rumble, low, distant, endless. It rolled through the trees like thunder that never stopped. At first, they thought it was artillery, then tanks. But the sound was softer, steadier, almost alive. The ground itself seemed to vibrate, and when they looked down from the hills, they saw the source. Convoys of trucks, headlights burning defiantly through the dark. It was a sound unlike war. It was industry in motion. At night, German soldiers could not sleep. The engines became their nightmares. Even when the convoys were miles away, the sound lingered in the air, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Some said they could feel it through the ground when they lay to rest. The Americans, one soldier wrote, fight with the earth itself. He was not wrong. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a supply chain. It was psychological warfare. The sound of endless engines became the anthem of inevitability. It told every German who heard it, the storm is coming, and it will not stop. By the first week of September, the German field intelligence had stopped trying to make sense of the numbers. Reports came in from every direction. Thousands of trucks moving without pause, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, supplies arriving faster than destruction could consume them. Officers along the front lines wrote of an army that seemed immune to exhaustion. They have no night, one report read. They do not stop to eat. They do not stop to breathe. The German mind, trained to trust reason, could not accept what it saw. Their own supply lines, bound by horses, wagons, fuel shortages, crawled through mud, while the Americans roared past with mechanical certainty. It was as if one side was fighting in the past, and the other in the future. Inside the war rooms, tempers rose like the smoke from their ashtrays. Engineers recalculated distance, fuel consumption, even gravity itself. Nothing explained it. It cannot be sustained, said one colonel. No system can move this much fuel this far. But every day proved him wrong. Every photograph, every intercepted radio message spoke of movement without end. For the first time, the German command began to understand what defeat might sound like. It was not gunfire or artillery. It was the hum of engines echoing through a land they no longer controlled. By mid-September, disbelief had turned to silence. The German officers who once mocked American logistics now spoke in whispers. They had seen the impossible. Convoys that never stopped, fuel lines that never emptied, soldiers who never seemed to sleep. They began to understand that they were not fighting men anymore. They were fighting machines, factories, and faith. One general wrote, "They have created a storm of motion. We cannot outfight it. We can only be consumed by it." That sentence never reached Berlin. The telegraph line was cut the next morning by retreating troops. For the soldiers in the field, the fear was simpler. Every night they heard the rumble, far away yet near enough to feel in their bones. The sound meant inevitability. They knew the trucks carried not just fuel or food, but momentum itself. When the noise reached the forests, the men looked at each other without speaking. Even the most loyal officers began to wonder if this was still a war between armies, or between eras. The old world of discipline and precision was fading beneath a new kind of chaos, one made of engines, roads, and light. And in that glow, the Germans saw the truth. The Red Ball Express wasn't just feeding Patton's army, it was feeding history. The miracle had begun, and the next chapter would reveal how chaos became harmony. From the outside, The Red Ball Express looked like madness. Thousands of trucks, no formations, no silence, no order. Engines roared day and night. Headlights blazed through fog and rain, and the roads shook with vibration. German observers called it wasteful, unmilitary, suicidal. But to the Americans, chaos was simply another word for progress. The system worked because it refused to stop. If one road collapsed, another was built overnight. If a bridge was destroyed, engineers made a new one before dawn. Mechanics repaired engines in the mud, using parts taken from trucks that had already died. In that rhythm of destruction and renewal, the impossible became routine. Each failure fed the system rather than breaking it. Nothing was wasted, not even mistakes. The Red Ball Express moved like a living organism, adapting every hour. Soldiers joked that the trucks were held together by hope, but hope proved stronger than steel. They didn't have the luxury of waiting for perfection. They only had the duty to move. And move they did, through wreckage, through exhaustion, through fear. Somewhere in that chaos, a kind of order was born. Not the order of planning, but the order of persistence. The French countryside had not seen such motion in centuries. Every road became a river of trucks, tires carving deep scars into the mud, engines burning with relentless purpose. At night, the headlights stretched for miles, a necklace of fire winding through the hills. The rain came often, turning the ground into rivers of clay, but even then the convoys didn't stop. Men chained their tires, cursed the weather, and pressed forward. In the distance, the flashes of artillery merged with the glow of engines until the horizon itself seemed to burn. Villagers stood at their doors, watching the endless stream pass by. Some wept silently, remembering years of occupation. To them, the roar of engines was the sound of liberation itself. And to the men behind the wheels, those faces were worth every mile. For all its noise and chaos, the Red Ball Express carried something sacred, the proof that movement meant freedom. Each rotation of a tire, each breath of smoke, was a victory over stillness. The roads of France were no longer scars of war. They had become arteries of life. Every hour brought new problems. Engines overheated, tires exploded, bridges gave way. And yet the trucks kept coming. Mobile repair units worked like battlefield doctors, diagnosing, replacing, improvising. In ditches and barns, under trees and broken street lamps, they worked without rest. Tools clanged against metal while generators hummed in the distance. The air smelled of gasoline and rain. In that noise there was faith, not the kind taught in churches, but the kind born from repetition and will. When trucks couldn't be fixed, they were stripped for parts. Engines swapped in minutes, tires replaced in seconds, cargo moved by hand if needed. Nothing was allowed to stop the flow. 15 minutes or it's dead, one mechanic said. Fix it or push it off the road. And so they did. Every breakdown was treated like a wound that had to be closed immediately. Each repair was an act of defiance against physics itself. The Germans had precision. The Americans had persistence. And persistence, it turned out, could be just as powerful as genius. By the middle of September, the Red Ball Express had become more than supply. It was circulation, the blood of an army that never stopped beating. From Normandy to the front, thousands of trucks moved like cells within a living organism. Each driver knew his route by heart, could trace every turn, every bend, even in darkness. They drove through fog so thick it swallowed the headlights, through towns that still smelled of smoke and fear. Bridges trembled beneath their weight, and yet they never broke. Every wheel that turned carried the sound of inevitability. Engineers built fuel depots every 25 miles, turning fields into oceans of gasoline. Mechanics worked in shifts that blurred into eternity. And still the road pulsed, alive, relentless. To the men within that motion, the outside world ceased to exist. There was only the hum of engines, the glint of light on wet metal, and the rhythm of progress itself. The Red Ball Express was no longer following orders. It was following destiny. It was the miracle of motion, made visible through steel and will. Every system should have failed. The numbers said it could not last. Roads were destroyed. Tires shredded faster than they could be replaced. Fuel was consumed faster than it arrived. And yet, it continued. The Red Ball Express defied physics and reason, powered by something stronger than machines, the human will to keep moving. Soldiers who once laughed at the madness now drove through nights of lightning and rain, their eyes burning red with exhaustion. "We do not stop," they said softly, "not while Patton moves." It was not just obedience, it was faith. By late September, even German officers had begun to watch in awe. They called it industrial magic, an empire on wheels. But for the men who lived inside it, it was far simpler. One more mile, one more day, one more engine kept alive. They did not think of glory or medals. They thought of motion. In every roar of an engine, in every flicker of a headlight through the mist, they heard something divine, the sound of freedom learning to move. And as the convoys rolled on, an idea began to form. What if fuel itself was not the miracle, but faith? Ahead lies a new chapter, where steel meets belief, and gasoline becomes grace. Few knew where the miracle truly began. Beneath the English Channel, far below the waves, an invisible artery carried life toward France. It was called Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean. They fed the Red Ball Express from a world the Germans could not see. Through those hidden veins flowed fuel, thousands of gallons every hour, traveling silently beneath the water. Engineers called it the pipeline under the ocean, but to the men on the ground, it was salvation. Each drop of gasoline that reached the coast meant one more truck could move, one more tank could roll. German submarines searched endlessly for the secret, but found nothing. The pipes were buried in silence, guarded by storms and distance. Above them, convoys thundered toward battle, never knowing their lifeline ran below their feet. The Americans had done the unthinkable. They had made the sea itself serve them. Every drop of fuel that crossed the channel carried not just energy, but belief that no obstacle was truly impassable. In that union of steel, water, and will, the Red Ball Express gained its soul. Fuel was both a blessing and a curse. Every convoy carried the power to move armies and the danger to destroy itself. Gasoline trucks rolled side by side with ammunition carriers, their metal tanks trembling with the weight of danger. The air itself smelled of risk, sharp and metallic. A single spark could turn a road into an inferno, and yet the drivers did not hesitate. They learned to live with the constant shadow of fire, their courage measured not by explosions, but by the calm it took to keep driving. At night, the glow of headlights reflected on the silver curves of fuel tanks, creating rivers of light that stretched beyond the horizon. The Germans saw those glowing lines and called them fire snakes. They tried to bomb them, to shatter the rhythm, but the roads always came alive again. What they did not understand was simple. This was not madness. It was devotion. The men of the Red Ball Express were not just delivering fuel. They were carrying faith in motion, belief that nothing, not even fear, could burn hotter than purpose. The miracle of motion required constant sacrifice. The fuel that burned inside Patton's tanks came from hands that never saw the front. Thousands of laborers, engineers, and quartermasters worked without sleep, filling drums, loading trucks, writing numbers into ledgers that glowed in the lantern light. Every barrel had a destination, every drop a purpose. They called it the chain of trust, because a single mistake could starve an entire army. The men who poured the fuel did not hear the guns, but they knew the sound of engines meant life. For them, every filled drum was an act of faith. They believed that movement itself was holy, that keeping the convoy alive meant keeping hope alive. They worked in rain and heat, in exhaustion and silence, never asking for credit. Their names were lost in the paperwork of war, but their fingerprints were written in gasoline. When Patton's tanks roared across the fields of France, they carried more than fuel. They carried the invisible labor of thousands, the silent prayer that every engine would start, and that freedom itself would never run dry. Every mile burned fuel faster than it could be replaced. Convoys became creatures of flame, trucks roaring through darkness, headlights glowing like molten veins. Men learned to listen to the sound of combustion, to feel the rhythm of pistons and spark. Each gallon mattered. Each drum was a heartbeat. The road was alive, and so was the fire that fed it. Engineers tracked consumption with pencils and prayer, watching the numbers blur into something that felt like faith. "As long as we burn," one officer said, "we live." And burn they did. The night air shimmered with heat. The horizon glowed red with motion. When fuel depots caught fire, the sky itself seemed to breathe. Men would stare into that orange storm and whisper that even destruction looked beautiful when it meant progress. No one doubted the cost anymore. They had given the war their machines, their strength, their sleep. Now they gave it their faith. For the men of the Red Ball Express, the line between fuel and spirit had vanished. The fire that powered the engines had also begun to power the soul. By late September, the Red Ball Express had become legend. Drivers spoke of it as if it were alive, a spirit of motion that moved through every man who touched the wheel. They no longer feared the distance, or the dark, or even death. They feared stopping. The road had become their religion. Every spark, every drop of gasoline, every hum of an engine was a prayer. When Patton's tanks thundered forward, they whispered, "We carried that fire." For them, movement was meaning, and motion was grace. The Red Ball Express had turned fuel into faith, and faith into freedom. To you, listening now, remember that history's miracles are rarely quiet. They roar, they tremble, they burn. If this story moved you, like the engines that never stopped, leave a like, subscribe, and keep this convoy of stories alive, because ahead lies a darker road, where the speed that once saved an army will begin to consume it. In the next chapter, the miracle will meet its price, and the question will no longer be how far they can go, but how much they can endure before the fire burns too bright. Speed had become both weapon and weakness. What once seemed miraculous now began to tremble under its own weight. Roads that carried victory began to break. Engines screamed louder with every mile. Tires burst, bridges collapsed, and men slept sitting up in their seats, afraid that stopping would break the rhythm that kept them alive. They had created a storm that could not be slowed. The Red Ball Express was no longer just movement. It was momentum with no mercy. The faster they went, the more fragile they became. Officers started to see the cost in silence. Convoys that once roared with energy now crawled through exhaustion. Men forgot their own names, driving by instinct, guided only by the faint memory of light on the horizon. The miracle had turned into a burden, a living thing demanding sacrifice. For every mile gained, another truck failed, another man collapsed. They were not losing to the enemy, but to the very speed they had worshipped. It was as if motion itself had grown hungry, and was now feeding on its creators. The faster they moved, the heavier everything felt. Supplies piled higher, engines worked harder, and the men behind the wheels began to disappear into fatigue. The Red Ball Express had no pause, no mercy, a living heartbeat that demanded constant sacrifice. Drivers hallucinated on endless roads, seeing faces in the fog, lights that weren't there. Some laughed quietly, others prayed, and many simply forgot what silence sounded like. "We are ghosts," one soldier wrote, "made of gasoline and noise." The officers tried to slow the convoys, but they couldn't. The system had grown beyond command. It had become instinct. Trucks rolled even when orders said stop. The road itself seemed to pull them forward. Some said it was Patton's spirit pushing them. Others said it was fear. But the truth was simpler. Motion had become addiction. It was no longer about fuel or orders. It was about survival through movement. And so they drove, through broken towns, shattered glass, and the faint echo of a world that could no longer keep up. By October, the miracle began to consume itself. Convoys collided in the dark, engines exploded under pressure, and men drove into craters they could no longer see. The Red Ball Express had become too fast for its own reflection. Drivers no longer spoke. They nodded, blinked, and followed the truck ahead like moths drawn to flame. The light of progress had become blinding. In the war diaries, one commander wrote, "We are burning victory faster than we can create it." The road that once carried hope was now lined with wrecks, silent, twisted monuments to speed. Mechanics worked beside the dead, welding new life into old metal while the air shimmered with heat and sorrow. Even success began to feel like loss. They had achieved the impossible, but at a cost that could no longer be counted in fuel or steel, only in men. The Red Ball Express had proven that motion could move mountains, but it had also proven that even miracles have limits. Engines do not cry, but the men who drove them began to. The sound of metal grinding into failure filled the air. Gearboxes cracked, axles snapped, pistons tore themselves apart. The roads had become graveyards of machines. Drivers stepped out into the silence after each breakdown and simply stared, their faces pale under the trembling light of burning fuel. There was no anger anymore, no frustration, only understanding. Every machine had its breaking point. So did every man. The miracle of motion had become a test of endurance, and many were already past their limit. Repair crews worked like surgeons, but there were too many wounds to heal. Spare parts ran out, and men began to tear pieces from wrecked trucks to keep others alive. Steel was cannibalized, bolts were stolen, engines were reborn in the mud. Every sound, a hammer, a wrench, a cough of exhaust, was a heartbeat fighting to stay alive. The Red Ball Express still moved, but slower, quieter, almost in pain. It was no longer a song of victory. It was a requiem in motion, the road itself beginning to weep. By the end of October, the roar had begun to fade. Convoys grew smaller, the rhythm less certain. The Red Ball Express, once unstoppable, was finally slowing down. It had done the impossible, carried an army across a continent, turned fuel into faith, and faith into victory. But even miracles must rest. The men behind the wheels were ghosts now, their eyes hollow, their hands trembling even when the engines stopped. Some looked at the empty horizon and didn't know what to do with silence. After months of motion, stillness felt like death. The generals called it success. The soldiers called it survival. But every man who drove the road knew what it had cost. Not just fuel or metal, but spirit. They had learned that victory was not a sound, not even a shout. It was a whisper that came after exhaustion. The Red Ball Express had ended, but its heartbeat remained, echoing in the cracked roads of France. And as the engines cooled, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Ahead lay a new silence, the kind that comes only after a storm, the kind that forces men to remember what they lost in the rush to win. When the engines finally fell silent, the world seemed to forget how to breathe. The men stepped out from their trucks and heard, for the first time in months, the sound of nothing. No rumble beneath their feet, no roar in their chests. Just the wind. For a few moments it was beautiful, and then it was unbearable. The Red Ball Express, the heartbeat of an army, had stopped. Drivers looked at one another in disbelief, unsure if victory was real or just another kind of dream. Their hands still trembled, fingers twitching for a wheel that was no longer there. The roads that once glowed with fire now lay empty. Mud dried, bridges quieted, and the air carried the faint scent of fuel and memory. Birds returned to the trees above the silent highways. Soldiers walked through the stillness, tracing tire marks that faded into the distance. It felt like walking through the veins of a sleeping giant. The world had won its war. But the silence that followed felt heavier than sound. The men who had lived in motion now stood still, and realized that peace, too, could be terrifying. They called them ghost roads, paths carved by steel and courage, now haunted by silence. Villagers returned to find miles of tire tracks stretching through the countryside, like scars left by a dream. Children played on rusted wrecks, climbing over what had once carried freedom. The air smelled of oil and rain, of something both gone and eternal. farmers rebuilt their fields, planting seeds in the grooves of history. But every so often, someone would stop and listen. And if the wind was right, they swore they could still hear it, the hum of engines rolling through the mist. The Red Ball Express was gone, yet it remained everywhere, in the stories whispered at taverns, in the broken bridges that refused to collapse, in the distant echo of a road that once carried faith itself. Even the Germans spoke of it with a strange reverence, as if it had been more force than enemy. And perhaps it was. It had turned mud into motion, chaos into rhythm, men into legends. Now all that remained were ghost roads, and the silence that guarded them. Peace had returned, but not to the hearts of those who had lived through motion. The drivers lay awake at night, hearing phantom engines in their dreams. Some said they could still feel the steering wheel in their hands, the vibration of tires under their feet. Others couldn't sleep at all, afraid of the silence pressing against their thoughts. They had carried the war forward, but it had followed them home. Their minds were roads that never ended. Every streetlight, every sound of a car backfiring, pulled them back to France. Years later, they would tell their children about the Red Ball Express, not with pride, but with a kind of awe. They spoke of it as one might speak of a storm or a prayer. It wasn't us, one veteran said. It was something larger, something that moved through us. And maybe it was. The miracle had been human hands, carrying divine motion. But now those hands trembled in stillness, unsure of what to hold when the world no longer needed them to drive. The war had ended, but the roads remembered. Long after the convoys vanished, the ground still carried their scars. Asphalt cracked in the same places where the tires once screamed. The ghosts of headlights still seemed to flicker at dusk, tracing invisible lines across the fields. In the quiet of early morning, farmers said they could feel faint vibrations in the soil, like a pulse that refused to die. The Red Ball Express had left something behind. Not just roads, but a memory that would not fade. Decades passed, and grass began to grow over the broken bridges. Children ran along the same paths where engines once thundered, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Yet beneath their feet, the earth still whispered of motion. Those who had seen it, those few who still lived, spoke softly of the miracle that had carried them. They said it wasn't about trucks or fuel or war. It was about faith in movement itself, the kind of faith that leaves a mark deeper than tracks in mud, a faith that even time could not erase. On a cold autumn evening, years after the war, a single truck appeared on one of those forgotten roads. It was old, rusted, but still alive. An American veteran sat behind the wheel, driving alone through the French countryside. The wind howled through the broken glass. The engine coughed, then steadied. He wasn't going anywhere, not really. He was chasing something he couldn't name. The hum of the motor filled the silence, and for a moment, he could almost hear the others again. The laughter, the voices, the road. He stopped at a bridge that had survived the war, stepped out, and looked across the valley. The sunset painted the sky in gold and crimson, the same colors that once lit the convoys of fire and steel. He smiled quietly and whispered, "We made it." Then he shut off the engine. The sound faded into the evening air, and the silence returned. Somewhere in that stillness, the Red Ball Express finally rested. But its story, its rhythm, kept moving. Because history, like the road, never truly ends. It only waits for someone to drive it again. The war had ended, but its rhythm never truly stopped. The sound of the Red Ball Express lingered in the minds of those who once drove it, an echo that refused to fade. Even years later, when peace had turned to memory, some swore they could still hear the distant hum of engines beneath quiet skies. It wasn't the noise they missed. It was the purpose. The road had given them meaning when the world was falling apart. And now, in peace, that meaning felt further away than ever. They had lived inside history's heartbeat, and silence, no matter how gentle, was harder to bear. The world moved on. Highways were built where dirt once carried destiny. New wars rose, new machines replaced the old. Yet something sacred lingered in the dust. Every truck, every driver, every drop of fuel had become part of something greater, a reminder that motion itself can be an act of faith. The Red Ball Express had burned across time, and though its engines had stopped, its echo still rolled forward. Somewhere, beyond memory, the road was still alive. Every miracle has a cost. The Red Ball Express had proved that even greatness demands exhaustion. It wasn't built by heroes, but by men who simply refused to stop. They drove through fear, fatigue, and fire, not because they sought glory, but because someone had to. The road they built wasn't paved with victory, but with endurance. Every broken engine, every sleepless night, every life lost along the way became part of a greater truth. That history isn't written by the loudest moments, but by those who keep going when the world goes dark. When the medals faded and the headlines vanished, what remained were stories whispered between veterans, quiet, honest, human. They spoke not of triumph, but of perseverance, of how ordinary men created something extraordinary simply by refusing to give up. The Red Ball Express was never just about speed. It was about spirit. And that spirit, once set in motion, could never be stopped. And now, you've traveled that road too, through the fire, the rain, the silence. You've heard the hum of engines that once carried faith across a continent. The story of the Red Ball Express isn't just about trucks or war. It's about what moves us, and what keeps us moving, even when everything else stands still. Every generation finds its own road to drive, its own light to carry through the dark. If this journey left you thinking, feeling, remembering, then don't let it fade into silence. Leave a like, subscribe, and share this story, not for numbers, but for memory. Because stories like this one survive only when they keep moving, from one listener to another. You have followed the convoy through the dust and the dusk. Now it's your turn to keep the echo alive, to pass it forward. The Red Ball Express is gone, but the road still lives, through you. In the end, every story is a journey. Some roads are made of asphalt, others of memory. The Red Ball Express may have vanished beneath grass and silence, but its essence remains. In every act of courage, every moment of motion that defies despair. History is not a straight line. It's a road that winds through every heart that dares to keep moving forward. As the last light fades over France, imagine the hum returning. Engines starting one by one, dust rising in the golden dawn. The sound grows softer, drifting into time until all that remains is stillness. Not emptiness, but peace. The kind that comes after purpose fulfilled. The road may sleep, but it never ends. It simply waits for the next traveler to awaken it once more.